with Donald Trump's legal team working overtime to delay or dismiss several ongoing legal battles involving the former president. First, the Trump team moved to dismiss the indictment in his federal election interference case by claiming presidential immunity. The former president claimed his efforts to overturn his 2020 election loss and remain in the White House were at the, quote, heart of his official responsibilities as president. In New York City, the Trump team filed to have his case dismissed regarding the falsifying of business records, the one related to hush money payments involving adult film actress Stormy Daniels. They argued prosecutors waited too long to bring their case. Next up, the former president's classified documents case, where Trump's lawyers have once again asked Judge Aileen Cannon to postpone the trial until after next year's presidential election. This while he's chatting about nuclear secrets. Also, the former president unexpectedly dismissed a $500 million lawsuit against his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, yesterday, while vowing to revisit it at a later date. Trump had been scheduled to sit down for a deposition in the case on Monday. Interesting timing. And lastly, Donald Trump's lawyers are expected to ask for a pause in his civil fraud trial today after an irate former president left the courthouse and New York City on Wednesday. His attorneys returned yesterday and informed Judge Arthur Engoron of their plans to seek a stay in the case, where the former president could have to pay a $250 million fine and be stripped of all of his New York state properties. They want to stay in that. They want to delay literally everything. Joining us now, former Watergate prosecutor Jill Wine-Banks. She's an MSNBC legal analyst, criminal defense attorney, and former Watergate prosecutor John Sale, state attorney for Palm Beach County, Florida, Dave Ehrenberg, senior executive editor for Bloomberg Opinion, and MSNBC political analyst Tim O'Brien, and MSNBC host Simone Sanders Townsend is with us as well. Great to have you all. Gosh, so many great people. Tim, I want to start with you because the civil fraud trial had so much drama this week with Donald Trump showing up for a case he lost, at least a huge part of it. He's already lost. It's been decided. Yet he's showing up day after day, claiming, by the way, he has to be there when he doesn't. I hear a lot of people kind of almost enjoying and saying the reason Trump is so upset about this is because he's finally exposed. Trump can lie about his brand and his money all day long. I don't think that's it. Is there something that more to the heart of his ability to operate as a company and as an individual, given what he's facing here?
Well, as you mentioned, Mika, this was already somewhat baked in before the trial even began. You know, the judge in the case already said he was guilty of fraud. He already recommended that Trump's business licenses get pulled in New York, and it looked like he was going to get fined. So this whole process right now is just really establishing how bad the pain will be for Trump. And what's remarkable about it is, even facing that, when he has every reason to discipline himself and court the judge and try to limit the severity of the sanctions he's facing, he runs into this whole thing like Yosemite Sam, shooting himself in the foot, shooting people around him, jumping up and down. Because I think there's two things going on. He knows that he's cornered, and he's angry that he's cornered. I don't remember another public, serial display of anger and aggression from Trump in a public forum like this. And I think it's because it's about his money. It's about his family's business history. A big portion of his wealth is tied up in New York. He's likely to be exiled from New York. I think the other reason is he's obviously playing to the MAGA base in the GOP. But that's also, I think, a political miscalculation, because I don't think he can get elected on the backs of those voters. He needs to be courting moderate and independent voters. And I think they look at this sort of display of anger and angst as grotesque. And I think that'll hurt him in the national election. So he's not thinking straight because he's cornered.
I would agree with you on the moderate Republicans that he needs. Many work for businesses or own businesses, pay their taxes, don't exploit the laws or try and claim that their hardware stores are double the size, or the new wing that they put on their business is 3 times the size that it is. They go by the book when it comes to their businesses, and they try and lead an honest life. And what this is revealing is that Donald Trump has been a massive fraud for years, and the apartment analogy is just perfect, actually. Let's run through this, and then I want to get to John Sale on the bigger picture here with the constitutional crisis. Jill Wine-Banks, Donald Trump says he's immune. He's immune from being accused of trying to steal the election. Your thoughts?
I don't think he's immune. He relies on cases that were civil cases. There's never been a holding that someone is immune from prosecution in a criminal case. And even his own party, Speaker McConnell, said that he thought that Donald Trump could still be held accountable after the impeachment ended in an acquittal, that there was still the criminal justice system. And so I think that he will not get away with this very vast expansion of the idea of presidential immunity. It fits more with what his attorney general did when he auditioned for the job, William Barr. He wrote a memo that said basically there was unlimited unitary executive power. And that's what he was arguing, is something like this, which would end up making the president above the law completely and totally. He couldn't be indicted for anything he did before, during, or after his presidency.
So, Dave Aronberg, there are so many Trump legal developments this week, it's hard to keep track. But one that sort of slipped under the radar late yesterday, he announced that he is dropping this lawsuit, I believe for $500 million, against his former right-hand man, his former fixer, Michael Cohen. Cohen, of course, has served some prison time and then very much turned on Trump. What do you make of this? Trump and, his attorneys left the door open that he could refile. But why do you think Trump made this calculation now? And is it because, well, he didn't want to be deposed?
Jonathan, the last thing that Trump wants to do right now is to sit for a sworn deposition while he has all these civil and criminal cases swirling around him. And there's nothing that Danya Perry, the lawyer for Michael Cohen, would have liked more than to depose Donald Trump. She's really good, and she was looking forward to it. But right before the deposition, he called it quits. And look, people were wondering why he showed up to the New York case this week. And the reason I think why he showed up was because the deposition in the Michael Cohen case was set for this week. He got a postponement because he had to be in court for his trial. Remember, he didn't show up for the E. Jean Carroll trial, but he showed up for this one. He did not want any part of this deposition. And now it was postponed to Monday. And right before that deposition, he said, forget about it. And don't expect him to file another lawsuit against Michael Cohen. He's not going to go through this again. This was all about show, not about go.
I've lost count on the amount of litigation that former President Donald Trump is dealing with. But John Sale, I want to get to your conclusion and concern, especially because in the fraud trial, the judge did put a gag order on Trump with his social media, and that his defiance seems to be ratcheting up when it comes to ratcheting up the rhetoric and reacting to what's happening in these court proceedings and showing his explosive anger out loud and perhaps even drumming up danger and violence from his base. That's what some are concerned about. You're concerned about a constitutional crisis. Can you please explain?
Well, he's no longer the president. He's a former president, but he's being treated as if he's the president. That's why we're talking about him 24/7. That's why when he goes to be caught, he doesn't have to be put in handcuffs like everyone else. He's not put in the lockup like everyone else. I think what I said once before when I was on the show is he's taking everything out of the Roy Cohn playbook. So just lashing out at the judge's clerk, I think he just couldn't help himself. I think he realizes that's over the top. But I think what we're going to be all looking at is the hearing on Monday before Judge Chutkan, in which there is a motion for protective order. I don't want to call it a gag order. And I think she's going to do a very narrow order, which is going to say things he can't do, which is going to be threaten witnesses. And then I think he won't be able to control himself. So the question becomes, what does the court do? And about to sum up, about 2 weeks ago, I thought there's really nothing they can do. They can fine him. He'll become more of a martyr. He'll raise more money. And I would have said, but you can't put him in prison. It just doesn't work practically. Well, I've changed my mind. I think that ultimately, if he defies a court order, it does more harm not to than to do it, because the message would be he's above the law. And I can assure you, if any one of my clients did what he is doing on social media, threatened witnesses, threatened to that a witness, General Milley, should get the death penalty, that they would be locked up. Mr. Blankenfried was locked up, and one of the judges from the Second Circuit said, the First Amendment does not give you the right to threaten or intimidate witnesses. So I really think that Donald Trump, as Governor Christie said, is afraid of prison. And I think with that holding over his head, we'll see. But the possible constitutional crisis, as my friend and former colleague Jill will remember, is the Saturday Night Massacre involved President Nixon threatening to disregard a court order. He ultimately didn't do that. If Donald Trump does disregard a court order, I think we have that potential crisis. What do we do about it? And the ultimate sanction is prison.